Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 249 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Savalsky, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Life here on Earth is mysterious and uncertain, and if there's one thing humans can't stand, it's uncertainty. So much of our collective energy has been spent on explaining the inexplicable, and when we're not trying to do that, we're actively trying to predict the future. Even those who pride themselves on their rationality will inevitably pick up the occasional magic 8-ball just to see. Not knowing the future is intensely uncomfortable, which is why humans invented a clever system to predict the future using numbers, called onomancy. This week, I spoke with Dr. Joanne Edge about onomancy in the Middle Ages. Jo is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh, having first been assistant editor on the Casebooks project at the University of Cambridge, Latin manuscripts cataloger at the John Rylands Library, and a lecturer in medieval history at the University of Manchester. Her new book is Onomantic Divination in Late Medieval Britain, Questioning Life, Predicting Death. Our conversation on how onomancy works, who used it, and how this fit in with medieval theology is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Jo, for joining me to talk about onomancy. This was a really fun book to read, and I can't wait to talk about it. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to hear you're very excited by it. I have to say I've probably read it a few more times, and so a bit less excited by it now. But nevertheless, looking forward to it.
Completely understand that. When you are at the end of writing a book, you're like, please, I never want to see this again. But the actual stuff behind it is pretty fun. So tell us what onomancy is.
Okay, so onomancy goes back in ancient tradition in various cultures, both Western and Eastern, as long as time you can imagine. So it's something that many people listening might be familiar with from the here and now, in the form of perhaps like a game you might have played at school in the playground. Basically, onomancy takes the numbers that relate to the letters of an individual's name, and these are added up into a total. And in the kind of medieval West, which is the tradition that I have studied, these numbers are added into a total. You add the number of the day of the moon on which the person fell sick. So it's normally about predicting the outcome of illness. Also, the number of the planetary weekday on which they fell sick. So that's there are 7 days of the week, so there's a different number for each day. There's a grand total, which is divided then by 30. And the remainder will tell you if that person is going to live or die, right? So sounds like a very serious topic and a very sort of almost childish solution to that. But I think what I'm trying to do in this book is show that there are very deep traditions of Platonism, which is Pythagoreanism, which are both kind of infused in medieval thought in various ways, debates over the power of names, power of numbers. So there is much more to it than it being this playground game. It's also still widely used in various traditions. For example, a friend of mine who's of Sri Lankan heritage was saying that it's often used in their culture to work out like propitious marriage matches. You know, is this person onomantically compatible with me? And of course, many of your listeners will know that astrology is a big deal in the Middle Ages and sort of lunar divination. So the fact is that you're adding lunar and astrological data. You're dividing by 30, which is the number of days of the moon in a month. So yeah, that's what onomancy is. There are many different varieties of it, and it's something that is just everywhere in the Middle Ages, along with various other types of divination to work things out that seem to us quite odd or even silly. But I think it's always worth looking at the bigger context.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this type of divination is mainly used for yes or no questions. So it's kind of like a Ouija board, right? Where you're like, okay, or a magic 8-ball, right? Where you're like, okay, I got to ask a yes or no question, but there's a lot of science involved.
Yeah, so there are certain types which are yes or no. So the one that I just described would be a sort of yes or no. There's no real nuance there, but you can work out sort of the severity of how long it might take to recover or die.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also versions of onomancy that pit two values against each other. So, for example, which of a married couple would die first, or the sex of an unborn baby, which in the Middle Ages are questions which are very pressing.
Yeah.
Because of inheritance, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very much the sense of answering questions that cannot be answered via means that are easy, right? These are the unknowable questions, really.
Yes.
So that's what it's all about.
Yes. And some of the questions that you mentioned in the book that people are asking are like, or some of the questions that it suggests you can ask from this method of divination, or things like who's going to win the joust, or is a person going to get out of jail soon, or are they going to return from travel? And it's interesting because when you see it written down, you realize the things that people are concerned with. As you're saying, people are looking for what the sex of the baby is because they're very concerned about it. So to see things like who's going to win a fight or a duel, or who's going to return from exile, that kind of thing, it's really interesting to see it all laid out there.
Yeah, certainly what I've tried to do is sort of to say, well, these are the pressing questions that this can answer. Obviously, though, the instructions will very often say, or anything else that you want to know. So we'll kind of say, here are some examples, but, and life or death is clearly the really pressing one for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, this idea of duels and battles, I mean, this is not only a reality, but also it's aspirational. There's a certain sense of, you have this kind of chivalrous atmosphere in the mid 14th century onwards, where there's very much a sense that you would aspire to information about military and gentlemanly pursuits and matters. But yeah, and then the kind of obviously the sex of the unborn baby is kind of pretty obvious. I mean, this is something that we're still concerned with today, even though inheritance in this country isn't necessarily predicated on men and the oldest male. So I think these are all questions really that we understand as relevant and timely today. It's not like we don't have wars today. It's not like we don't, people, all kinds of uncertainties still exist that we can't put an answer to. So that, I think, is the hook to get people to sort of think about ways of knowing and ways of reassuring, I think, as well. Because a lot of the time, it's almost about reassuring yourself or making a decision, perhaps, rather than getting some solid answer.
Yeah, I mean, we're still using all sorts of methods to help us make decisions or try and figure out what the future is going to be. There are so many of those things that you do definitely see, as you're saying, in childhood, especially. I think probably because in childhood you feel like you have no control over anything, so maybe you need to divine what's happening.
Yeah, and people still use. I mean, I've got a lot of friends who would not consider themselves to be particularly spiritual or particularly into that kind of thing, but who will do tarot for kind of, like I say, their own self-soothing. Or there are all kinds of things, there's tea leaves, there's fortune telling, astrology still quite big. And I think there's a sense that we don't all take it very seriously. There's levels of how seriously people take these things. You might read your horoscope for a laugh, and it's not necessarily any different in the Middle Ages, because of course people have all different ways of thinking about things, and there would have been many people that were probably pretty skeptical about this in the way that people are skeptical about everything, anything. So that's the other point to bear in mind, of course, is that people aren't all taking this very seriously or not. There's a kind of massive range of how people would react to this. And of course, most people can't read in this time. So this is very much something that's being done by people who can read and count, who are numerate and literate. Yeah. So that's the other thing to bear in mind, is that this is not something that's happening across society in that way.
Yes, and it makes it seem more magical if you have to have the right education to be able to access this information. It makes it seem more legit. And one of the interesting points that you make in the book is that in some ways, these tables of onomancy lasted because people thought, maybe we're not doing it right, but maybe there was a right way to do it. So people were trying to get back to an original, and possibly that's why it lasted so long, because people were like, well, there might be something to this that we're not seeing. We need to get back to how it was done in Greek times, right?
Yeah, so this is something that is noted by scholars like Jean-Patrice Boudet, and it's a very instructive point. So because all Greek letters have corresponding numbers, right? And because the device that becomes corrupted in the Middle Ages is from a Greek descent, when you translate that into Latin, you have a problem, because not all Latin letters have a corresponding number, right? You've got CL, V, I, M, D, X. There's no rational system of what we call abjad, which you see in Hebrew, in Arabic, and in other languages, ancient languages in which you find this device. So Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, they all have this system. So what happens is you get a situation where not only are medieval scribes that start copying this thing in the early Middle Ages guessing a lot of the time as to what the corresponding number should be, you also get scribal error, which happens in any kind of copying. It's very easily done still today, something called I-skip, where you will skip lines. If there are similar words on lines that are next to each other in a text, it's very easy to skip. You get errors, you get lapses in concentration. And so for these reasons, you end up with an incredibly varied set of translations of particular onomantic devices in the early Middle Ages. You also, after, certainly in the English context, which is what I work on, the British context, if you like, after the Norman Conquest, especially after the Norman Conquest, what you get is the addition of letters like W, which are new. So what you see is scribes saying things like, just make it 2 V's, whatever the value of V is, make it double it, right, if you get a W. So of course, you're in a situation where you end up then getting lots of different devices copied together with different numerical values, I think, in order to try and find a correct device. But of course, that means that more get copied and more get preserved. So it's a particularly paradoxical thing about this device, is that on its own terms, it is useless, right? Because it's not right.
Yeah.
But that also means that it's being spread around. That's one reason, I think, why it's copied more as well. So it's baffling, really. But of course, people might not realize that. You might not be copying 3 devices together because you realize they're corrupted. You might just be looking at a previous manuscript and copying that without realizing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's that too. But yeah, something that always amuses me is the fact that this thing throws up ambiguities because of that reason. But I think that's also probably not a bad thing.
No. And if you are coming at this, and this is an important point as well, is if you're coming at this as a Christian, which people are, I mean, it's not something that is zero sum, and that today you still have people who will say that they are faithful and they also love astrology, and that's perfectly fine. And so you have people that are coming to this who are pious Christians. They might just figure God's going to tell me the right answer anyway, so it's fine, which begs the question, of course, where does this fit in a Christian ideology? Because divination, or deciding to predict the future, is a tricky thing theologically. So can you walk us through how this fits within theology at the time?
So, it all goes divination, the prediction of the future via the interpretation of signs. It's a part of the late Roman state. It's a part of the late Roman state apparatus. But you have professionals that are doing it. You've got haruspices who examine the entrails of animals. You've got augurers and auspices who examine the cries and flights of birds. But it's very much a sense that it's not anyone doing it. This is state-sanctioned people doing it. And this becomes a lot more problematic in the later empire, because you've got emperors getting paranoid about people doing things they shouldn't, things like predicting the death of the emperor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is before the Roman Empire is Christian. So what you get are magic and divination, which are 2 separate things being kind of intertwined in condemnations. And then what happens is, in the 4th century CE, so about 100 or so years before the sort of fall of the Western Empire, what you get is the Christianization of the Roman Empire. But this doesn't happen overnight. So Emperor Constantine, Christianity is the official state-sanctioned religion of the Roman Empire. And then you have a guy called Augustine, who is sort of... Augustine is like... If Jesus Christ is the lead singer of the Middle Ages, Augustine is like the lead guitarist. So Augustine, a church father, Saint Augustine of Hippo, is an incredibly influential early Christian church father. And he sees these divining happening, and he says, no, you can't do this. You can't do this for 3 main reasons. Number 1, there's a really important doctrine in Christianity called free will, and it's how Christians explain why God allows bad things to happen. If God loves everyone, if God wants everyone to be okay, why do bad things happen? And this is explained by the fact that man has free will. And that's really, really important to the entire cosmology of Christianity. Without free will, you cannot reconcile God allowing bad things to happen. So that's really important. So if the future's set in the stars, or if the future is plotted out completely, where does that leave free will? Secondly, divine providence. You can't know, only God can know the future, right? Who the hell do you think you are, coming here and deciding that you know better and you can bypass God? and know this stuff. And thirdly, and this is a really key one, is that divination always operates, Augustine says, with the involvement of demons. Whether you know it or not, this is the trickery of demons that's giving you these answers. And because magic is also seen as essentially, at this time, having that involvement with demons, divination and magic get linked, but they are different. So what you get then is, Augustine is incredibly influential. You get commentators like Isidore of Seville in the 7th century, and then people like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th, and this kind of reinforces, they all sort of reinforce the fact that divination is not a permissible thing in the Christian cosmology because of these three big reasons. What Aquinas does is say, but astrology used for certain purposes is a little bit different because it's based on what might happen, what's likely to happen, tendency. That's okay, but divination isn't. So astrology's always had a bit more of a nuanced story, I think, in all of this. But I think what you've also got at the same time as the kind of advent of Christianity and Augustine saying, but no, is this sort of pervasiveness of Platonism, where you have debates over, do numbers have any power? Do numbers exist beyond? So it's a sense of universals, which is a really powerful philosophical debate. Still happens today, For example, a question would be, does a name say anything about the owner? Are names divinely inspired, or is it just a name? So is Danièle a name that you were given, or does Danièle mean something more? Do you share some essence in common with other people called Danièle? And this is the same for numbers. Do numbers have power, or are they just signifiers, right? So it's a case of whether something exists in and of itself, or whether it is a descriptor or a signifier. So this happens with both names and numbers, two core components of onomancy. And so there are sort of these competing, the ancient tradition that medieval theologians seek to recover is a pagan tradition, but there are bits of it that they feel are worth saving, because how could the pagans know about God before Jesus? So it's not their fault, So which bits are worth saving and which bits can be kind of reconciled to Christianity? And so, yeah, I think it's perfectly possible that you would look at one of these onomantic devices and say, there's nothing here that is wrong. And also it may be depending on who you are. I think you spoke about this earlier, who you are makes a difference. If you're a doctor, a monk, someone with training, maybe you can do this because you've got the authority to do it, But there's always, I think, like you said earlier, you've got friends that are pious Christians and also have no problem with astrology. We're all capable of cognitive dissonance, at least. But I think if we weren't, I don't think the human race would probably have survived. But there's all kinds of ideas that go on in our heads, right? That maybe don't make, you might go to a doctor and get treated for something with sort of mainstream medicine, which you understand its operative processes, but that might not work. So you might go to what are they called? Acupuncturist, or you might, and those have much less kind of understandable ways of, they operate essentially on completely different philosophy to mainstream medicine, but you still might try both. I think we all are very complex beings and we hold multiple different ways of thinking.
Yeah.
Including magical thinking, right? So
yes. It's always the pursuit of certainty, right? If you can't get it one way.
I have to say, as an obsessive compulsive disorder sufferer, it's something that I deal with on a daily basis. And this is not something that needs to come out of your podcast. It's perfectly fine. It's not a secret. But I do think there's something about that desire for certainty and the desire. This is still with us. Mm-hmm. This need for signs and prediction and reassurance, I think, is part of us.
Exactly. You want that reassurance, and we'll do just about anything to get it. And I think that is a very important part of that disorder, but also an important part of most people's lives. So we know that theologically, this is a gray area, if not completely condemned. I think Aquinas is like, well, it's fine. I guess if we really need to figure something out, all right, sort of. But that begs the question, like, who is using this? So you got at this a little bit, but can you spell it out for us a little bit more clearly? Who has these tables in their books? Who's using them, at least as close as we can get to knowing who's using them?
Yeah. So what I did was I took the approach of saying, okay, like, who are the user groups of this thing and how can I work that out? Because mainly all we have for the Middle Ages is the manuscripts that survive with these things in them. So what we can do is we can take two approaches to kind of working out user groups. You can say, what other texts is it with? Is it medical texts? Is it monastic texts? So can we kind of make a reasonable assumption based on that? And the other one is ownership, what we know of ownership. And there are many books that we know, for example, were produced in particular libraries, so monastic libraries or university libraries, or have inscriptions. And so we can kind of make a sort of relatively intelligent guess from there. So that's how I approached it. And I kind of divided the user groups into 4 different groups. And these are very porous groups that kind of all mingle in with each other. But I kind of went with 4 different user groups. I went with medical practitioners, so literate medical practitioners, be they university trained or be they treat in their commonplace books for treating patients. I went with the aristocracy and gentry, which is where the duels and the battles and the combat side of things comes in, but also the anxieties around the courts and around the trouble you can get yourself in if you are doing divination. And then students at the university. So there are several manuscripts we can link to particular parts of the university. But of course, universities are monastic institutions. So there's a lot of bleed between the monasteries and the universities. And then monks. Most people, when I tell them about monks, that's the most surprising user group. Precisely because, for reasons we've discussed, monks are supposed to be the most pious members of society. But monks are doing all kinds of stuff they shouldn't be doing. They're the worst for it. And I think probably because there's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, they're doing much worse things than divination. They're doing black magic, they're doing summoning demons, necromancy, all kinds of things that make this look like nothing. So those are sort of the 4 user groups. And those are sort of, I suppose, what you would think of as the 4 main ways that people become literate at this time. Reasons you would be literate would be because you are a student, a monk, a practitioner, or educated member of lay society, so an aristocrat. I've got no evidence of women using these things. That doesn't mean they didn't. More than likely they did. Many women were literate at this time. Not as many as men, and women don't go to university. We can say, for example, that the students and masters, the scholars, were definitely men. But late medieval gentry and aristocratic women that could well have been literate. Of course, you have nuns, but we have no evidence of specific nunneries owning these things. So I'd say the gender angle for me is almost definitely mostly men, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So there could well have been women doing this too, and no doubt were. Many women are also healers, obviously.
Yes. Well, this was one of my questions as I was reading it. Like, it's not a surprise to me, as somebody who's written on monks, it's not a surprise to me that monks are messing with this stuff.
Not a surprise to you.
No, not at all. And I was wondering about the nuns who might be also trying this out on the sly. But as with so many things to do with nuns, they don't leave many traces of their activities, but the monks do. And I think that you can extrapolate often from what they're doing to what the nuns are doing as well.
It's a shame not to have more detail from nunneries. And they may well be there and I just haven't found them, or it may be that nuns are too busy doing other stuff. It's hard to say. It would be lovely to get an example of women doing this, especially because we do have, evidence in the late Middle Ages of female fortune tellers being prosecuted, but that's generally lower ranks of society. Well, lower ranks of society or actual aristocrats,
Yeah.
But not specifically for divination. And a lot of the time, it's hard to work out what's, with these kind of legal prosecutions, what is imagined crime and what people are actually doing, if anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely very male, I would say, at this point.
Yeah. And you really draw a strong connection, which I think is completely right, where you're bringing it not only into the sphere of education, but definitely into medicine, which is something you brought up a couple of times today as well. And really it having to do with prognosis. And I think that the way that you get into prognosis in the book is very intuitive and very sensitive in the way that you're thinking about today, people who are still having medical issues. They want to know how long they have. And so this was a tool that I think sits in a very, very interesting space where theologically you're not supposed to be using it. And if you've gone to medical school, you've gone through an educational system that is very heavily based in theology. So you're not really supposed to do it. But at the same time, you're trying to do everything you can for your patient, including giving them clues as to how long they're going to be living. So can you tell us a little bit about how this is used in prognosis?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, again, we don't have any accounts of people saying, I used this and here's what I did. So we're extrapolating from this manuscript context. But I think there are 2 really interesting and kind of instructive modes of thinking that exist around the late Middle Ages and death. The first is exemplified in canon, I think it's 21 or 22 of the Fourth Lateran Council, which takes place in 1215. This is a big meeting of all the head honchos of the church to try and sort out the spiritual well-being of Christendom, of people in Christendom, and how priests can better support their flocks to be good Christians, right? And what this canon says, and this is like the religious authority, what the canon says is you have to confess to a priest before any medical treatment. And it says the reason we say this is because if a sick person sees a priest, they might panic and think they're going to die, so they've called the priest, and then literally lose the will to live and die. So if there's a priest there coming in just to kind of give confession as normal, it won't panic the patient, because there's a real sense that this idea of losing the will to live is really big in the Middle Ages. I'd say there are analogues to that today, which I'll come to. So basically, religious authorities are saying it's really important that someone doesn't get wind of the fact that they could die, because it might make them die quicker. And what you see medical authorities saying, once medicine kind of becomes more professionalized after the introduction of universities, and they become a sort of professional class, if you like, and they're trying to kind of set some standards for themselves. What they say is, for God's sake, if a patient's dying, for God's sakes, don't tell them. What you do is you take their family to one side, and what you say to them is, I think you're going to need to make some preparations, but you need to keep their spirits up. So what you do is you go to the patients and you say, sing a song, here's some prayers. You kind of keep their spirits up. And that way, if the patient survives, you're a miracle worker. And if the patient dies, the family have been informed and have been very aware that this was going to happen. And they have made adequate preparations. So there's still a sense of this idea of losing the will to live. So a doctor can be in a tricky position professionally at that point, because you cannot bring in a priest to do the last rite. You can't risk your patient dying without the last rites. That's so important. But bringing in a priest could hasten or even cause the death of the person if they panic. So it's fraught in all sorts of ways. And I don't think these discussions are very different today. I think modern biomedicine probably has a better grasp of knowing how likely it's going to be, given your diagnosis and the rest of it. But doctors are still really reluctant to give definite answers. And that's not necessarily because they're worried about getting it wrong from their end, but because it could put the patient into a sort of cycle of despair. But then you can't lie to someone. You can't say, oh, it'll all be fine. Because, many people today are still religious and would want those religious rights. But people need to put their affairs in order. They need to get that bucket list ticked off, But I think it's also something about knowing your patient, because I think it would certainly depend on who you were, whether you'd want a more definite estimate or whether you would want something a bit more nuanced. So these are questions that I think are so relevant today. I think medical ethics are still, they're fluid. They're not fixed somehow. These are things that are always revisited and always have to be dealt with very sensitively. And I think this is a question that gets to the heart of human beings and how we think about death, how we memorialize the dead, and how we prepare for those moments. And these are not new. These are ubiquitous, and they're questions that we can all understand. I don't really like bringing COVID into it because it feels a bit insensitive, but I certainly think these anxieties around sudden death are much more present since, there were people being hospitalized who had been healthy previously who ended up on ventilators and all kinds of horrible things during those horrible early months of the pandemic, So these are things that are very present with us. And I suppose I want to try and provide some reassurance myself with this stuff, in the sense that these are not new questions. These are anxieties we've always grappled with. People have always been acutely aware of death. And I would say it's probably one of the biggest motivating things in our lives is the fact we're going to die.
Yes.
And it's the only thing we have any certainty about, isn't it? Death. Well, apparently it's death and taxes, apparently. But I think death is something that really we all need to reassure ourselves over somehow.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is something that could easily be missed if you're reading stuff about the Middle Ages. It might be easy to miss something like a discussion of medical ethics, or the fact that people observe that your mindset has a lot to do with whether you're going to live longer or not. Like, these are very subtle and observant things that these medieval people are noticing and recording. And adjusting their behavior around. And it's just so interesting to see it laid out for us. So in the same section, you're talking about like what a doctor's responsibility is, how they're going to use onomancy to reassure their patient. And one of the things that was a little bit funny was because there's so much ambiguity in the way that you're using names and numbers to predict the future, you can actually do it in two different tables, two different ways, so that you've hedged your bets, which I thought was pretty funny.
Yeah, and that goes back to this idea of your reputation as a doctor. You don't want to get a bad rep. Mm-hmm. But there's also stuff in these rules that says, don't flirt with the ladies in the household. Don't be caught with the maid on your own or with the daughter of the gentleman of the house on your own. It's about conducting yourself because you are representing your profession. And I think there's something, very relatable about that right now as well. And I do think there's something very human about all of this. And I think with medieval medicine especially, and this is something that is just unfortunately an occupational hazard for me, is there's a sense of, oh, silly people, what were they thinking? How stupid were they? Look at this stupid thing. How could they be so silly? No wonder they, and it's like, actually, what this should make you feel is grateful, yes. I have to say. So I think I'm not really a great believer in progress in that sense of, everything's fine now and it was terrible then. But I think modern biomedicine is one area where we can say, oh, good. We finally have a way of approaching things that, it may not be perfect. It may be, in some cases, very unethical. There may be all kinds of questions and problems with it, but children don't routinely die. Well, where I live in Britain, children don't routinely die of preventable illnesses. So I think humanizing this is really important because it's easy to think of the Middle Ages as a cartoon. When you hear about the events of ridiculous battles and, people getting their heads chopped off and dying on the battlefield, or whether it's horrible surgery. And I get that there's a place for that. It's a way in for kids to get into it. It's certainly how I got interested in stuff was, blood and guts and castles when I was a kid and the rest of it. But I think these are human beings that we're talking about. And I welcome the discussions that are being had in museums at the moment around things like how we display the bodies of dead people and how we respect the different cultures that people may have come from. Because it's very easy to forget that this is a human being the same as you. So I would say that human beings haven't evolved that much since the Middle Ages. We are incredibly intelligent, complex beings. And so, of course, all of these questions, all of these observations are happening as they would today.
Yes.
Everyone's an individual. People think differently. It's easy to point and laugh, but that's really what I'm trying to humanize a little bit, is that tendency to consider this to be just a relic of the past that's no longer whatever, because I think that also very conveniently denies the fact that we still like to interpret signs and we still like to toss a coin or place a bet, or we still want these answers and we still want this certainty, whether we like it or not. So I think it's actually quite arrogant to assume that this is something that we've left alone completely in that way, even if we probably have a better clue about how the body works these days.
Yes. Well, I mean, you're preaching to the choir. This is my entire thing, is like finding what is relatable about the people who are living before us. Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's what I enjoyed most about the book, is that you're vibing in the same way. We see them as people. And I think when you look at these onomantic schematics or designs or actual pages that we're looking at, when you look into it and see it sort of like looking into the Matrix, you start to see all of the questions that people had and those concerns, those real human concerns that people had that they needed an answer to. And so it's like when you imagine someone who's still going to see someone who's reading tea leaves or someone who's doing palmistry, a lot of those people are coming from a place of real concern or turbulence and all of those things. So looking at these things, in some ways it is silly. And one of the arguments you make is that some people were probably using it as a silly toy when they're in university or something. But there are a lot of people bringing a lot of emotion to this. And so I really enjoyed the way that you explored this.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate way of putting it. This is a very emotionally charged topic, I would say.
Okay, but I'm going to bring it back to the silly before we go, and that is to ask you, did you try it? Did you try this on your own?
Well, that's an interesting question, Danièle, because my name is Joanne. but I'm known mainly as Jo.
Yes.
If I'm using a Latin device, do I go with Johanna, which would be like a Latin version of my name? Now, all three of these are going to throw up very different results, right? And it depends which device I use. So no, I've never tried it, but Keith Jones, who quoted throughout my book because he is a brilliant historian of medieval medicine, whose book came out just before mine in the same series on medicine of the friars. I did write a little piece for his unofficial Festschrift, which did a whole onomancy for him, which was based on whether he would be Peter or Pete and the differences that would throw up. So I haven't ever tried it because it doesn't work on its own. But I have said to students, what's your name? And we've worked through it together just for a bit of fun. But yeah, I think that demonstrates, though, how ambiguous this can be and how that isn't necessarily bad, whether you're Jo or Joanne or Joanna, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is quite fun. But then it would have been fun, like I say, as you say, it could well have been a sort of practice tool at the university for all we know, a bit of a game.
Yeah, well, as we were talking before we started recording, you mentioned that you grew up speaking Welsh, and I can't help but think this would be a whole new complication to trying to figure this out. Because again, the Welsh alphabet is different. How would you figure out what the answer to your question is?
Well, the first thing to say is that I did discover a manuscript that was produced in Pembrokeshire, which is where I'm from in Wales. There's a big Norman settlement in Pembrokeshire, so it's South Pembrokeshire is quite English speaking. So I was very excited to find one of these manuscripts was produced at a place called Manorbier in South Pembrokeshire. The second thing to say is that it is a myth that Welsh has no vowels because we have 7 vowels, 2 more than English. But yeah, and the other thing we have in Welsh is double letters, so double F, double D, double L. So again, I think there would be a dilemma there is, do you just make that the value of 2 Fs or is there a separate thing for that? But yeah, translating onomancy into Welsh doesn't seem to be something that happens, but maybe there's someone out there doing a PhD on it right now and it will be wonderful to see what comes of that. But no, it would absolutely throw up so many problems because I don't think Welsh has got an abjad either, as far as I know. So I don't think there would even be sort of corresponding numbers that would work. We don't have any letters that English doesn't have. We just get rid of the silly ones. Well, J isn't a letter in Welsh, right? So my name would have to start with an I, right? That kind of thing. Lots of ambiguity. Perhaps a project for a rainy day.
There you go. If there's a question that you really, really want answered, you can figure it out in all different ways and maybe invent a Welsh way of doing this. Well, thank you so much, Jo, for coming on and talking to me about onomancy. It's been a pleasure meeting you, and this has just been so much fun. Thank you.
Oh, no, it's been great, Danièle. Thank you so much.
To find out more about Jo's work, you can visit her page at the University of Edinburgh. Her new book is Onomantic Divination in Late Medieval Britain, Questioning Life, Predicting Death. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. Well, it's International Medieval Congress Week. Yay. So I'm actually taking a little time out between sessions to talk to you. But I'm actually doing it from home, so I'm work from home this year. But it is the largest medieval gathering of academics in the world. And it happens every year, University of Leeds. We've had a lot of fun there, and I'll be doing it online, listening to 2,100 papers about medieval studies.
You personally are going to listen to 2,100 papers.
I'll do my best. That's my plan for the next week. It's a big event. It's always a lot of fun. I've been hearing a few papers already that I've enjoyed. All the kind of little topics, crusades, wars, all that fun stuff that I always enjoy.
Yeah, little topics like wars and crusades. Yeah, so there's something for everyone.
Yeah, so we have news about that. They tell you some of the bigger important plenary sessions are going on. You can read about that on medievalist.net. Plus, another thing I'm missing out by not being in England is the National Portrait Gallery has opened their new exhibit, 6 Lives, the story of Henry VIII's queens. It looks very fancy. A nice collection of original portraits, some modern interpretations. Just from what I've seen online, it looks really, really swank.
Yeah. I mean, it's the story that people just can't get tired of. Henry VIII and his 6 wives.
So we've got news and video about that. Plus, we have 30 charming sayings about medieval cats and dogs.
Ah,
Yes.
just goes to show that people had a great love for cats and dogs back in the day as well. Even though they were a lot more, they worked harder for their keep than my dog does. People still love them as pets for sure.
Yeah, and they came up with lots of fun little sayings found like medieval English writers from the 14th to 16th century. So I got two that I really loved.
Okay.
First one is about cats. As clean as cats had licked him.
Nice.
And I know that to be true. And then for dogs, hungry dogs will eat dirty puddings.
It's true. It's true. Hungry dogs will eat pretty much anything. So don't leave your socks on the floor is what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. Oh, no.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot more truisms to read on that article about cats and dogs. So thanks, Peter, for bringing it to our attention and putting it on medievalist.net.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you who are out there supporting my work, whether it's letting the ads play through, recommending my podcasts and books to your friends, or joining medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have a special place in my heart because it's your patronage that allows me to keep this podcast going. So thank you. If you'd like to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. And if you'd like everyone to know you're a medieval fan, you can visit tpublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet to pick up some sweet medieval merch, including shirts with my super awesome logo on them. And if you do, take a pic and tag me on social media so I can say thank you. For everything from predictions to fictions, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X @medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN-medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a fantastic day.